A man sits in a rented room in Rome chained at the wrist to a Roman soldier, and he picks up a pen. He is writing to a group of people scattered across the empire, people who gather in homes, who share meals, who are being watched by informers and occasionally dragged before magistrates. He writes to them constantly. 13 letters survive, maybe more, that have been lost. And in every single one of them, in every line he ever wrote that we still possess, the Apostle Paul never once uses the word Christianity. Not once. He does not call it that. He does not call the people who follow Jesus Christians in his own voice. He does not describe what he is building, defending, and dying for as a religion called Christianity. That word, the one printed on seminary doors and government census forms and the covers of 1,000 books, is not a word Paul reached for. Not because he was hiding something, because the word did not exist yet, not the way we use it, and because the thing he was actually describing was something stranger and more specific than a religion with a name tag. Most people hear this and assume it is a technicality, a linguistic curiosity, the kind of trivia you mention at a dinner party and then move on from. It is not. Because when you go looking for what Paul actually called this movement in his own words in the actual Greek text of his letters, you find a handful of terms he uses again and again, terms that reveal something the modern word Christianity quietly erases. He was not naming a religion, he was naming a people, a road, and a family, and tracing those words all the way from the Hebrew scriptures through Paul's letters and into the record of secular history outside the Bible, tells you something about what this movement actually was in its first decades before anyone had settled on what to call it at all. So here is where we are going. We are going to look at the actual words Paul used instead of Christianity. We are going to trace where those words came from, what they meant to the ears that first heard them, and how they connect backward into the Old Testament and forward into the way outsiders eventually describe this group. And by the end, I think you will see that the absence of the word Christianity from Paul's vocabulary is not a gap. It is a clue. Let's start with the word he uses most often, because it is hiding in plain sight in almost every letter he wrote, ekklesia. You have heard this word before, even if you did not know it. It gets translated into English as church, and that translation is not wrong, but it flattens something important. Ekklesia is a compound Greek word. It comes from ek, meaning out of, and kaleo, meaning to call. Literally, it means the called out ones. And here is what most people miss about this word. Paul did not invent it, and he was not the first to use it for a religious gathering. Ekklesia was a civic term. In Greek city-states, the ekklesia was the assembly of citizens, the ones formally called out from the general population to gather, deliberate, and make decisions for the city. When Paul uses this word for the followers of Jesus, he is reaching for language that already meant something specific, a body of people summoned out of the general population for a purpose. But there is a second layer underneath that one, and it goes back further than Greek civic life. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in the centuries before Jesus, in the translation called the Septuagint, the Hebrew word kahal, meaning assembly or congregation, was regularly rendered into Greek as ekklesia. Kahal is the word used for Israel gathered at Mount Sinai in Exodus, the assembly of the covenant people standing before God to receive his law. So when Paul writes to the ekklesia of God in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 2, he is not coining a fresh label for a new club. He is deliberately placing this scattered group of Jesus followers, Jew and Gentile, together inside the lineage of Israel gathered at Sinai. The called out ones at Corinth stand in the same line as the called out ones at the mountain. That is not a religion with a brand name. That is a claim about continuity, about being grafted into an assembly that has existed since God first called a people to himself. And here's the detail that changes everything about how you should hear that word every time it shows up in Paul's letters. He almost never uses it to describe a building, a denomination, or an institution. He uses it for people. The church that is in their house, he writes in Romans chapter 16 verse 5. Not the church that meets in their house, the church that is their house, the gathered people themselves. Ekklesia for Paul is not architecture. It is assembly. It is a summons and a people who answered it. Now let's look at a second term Paul reaches for constantly, one that reveals something even more intimate than the called out ones. He calls them hagioi. It gets translated saints, and that word has picked up so much religious varnish over the centuries that people hear it and think of statues and stained glass of a special tier of extra holy Christians canonized centuries after death. That is not what Paul meant, and it is worth slowing down here, because this is one of the places where the English translation genuinely obscures the original force of the word. Hagioi comes from the root hagios, meaning holy, and it carries the sense of being set apart, consecrated, marked off for a particular use. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew equivalent kadosh is applied to the Sabbath, to the tabernacle, to the priesthood, to the nation of Israel itself. Israel is called to be a Kaddish people, a holy nation, not because they had achieved moral perfection, but because they had been set apart by God for His purposes among the nations. When Paul opens a letter with, "To the saints who are in Ephesus," he is not addressing a spiritual elite. He is addressing every ordinary believer in that city, tent makers and slaves and merchants and mothers, and calling them collectively the set-apart ones. It is not a title you earn. It is a status you receive the moment you belong to this assembly. Paul uses this word so often in letter after letter that it functions almost like a name tag for the whole movement. Not Christians, saints, the holy ones, the set-apart family of God, scattered across an empire that had no idea what to make of them. And that brings us to a third word, maybe the most tender one Paul reaches for, and it is a word you already know, adelphoi, brothers, sometimes rendered brothers and sisters in modern translations, because the word functioned as a gender-inclusive term for members of the same family in the Greek of that era. Paul uses this word so constantly that if you removed it from his letters, you would lose a huge part of the emotional temperature of the text. "I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers," he writes in Romans chapter 1, verse 13. "Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have laid hold of it," he writes in Philippians chapter 3, verse 13. Over and over in nearly every letter, this is his default address. Not citizens, not members, not adherents to the faith. Brothers. Think about what that word does. A citizen is a legal category. A member is an administrative one. A brother is a claim about identity, about blood, about the kind of obligation you cannot resign from. Paul is describing a movement that understood itself at the deepest level as a family. Not a family by birth, but a family by adoption, which is itself a word Paul uses explicitly. In Romans chapter 8, verse 15, he writes that believers have received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. Abba is Aramaic, the intimate word a small child would use for a parent closer to Papa than the formal father. Paul takes that word untranslated and drops it directly into a Greek letter because no Greek word carried the same warmth. This movement in Paul's own language was not a religion you joined. It was a family you were adopted into with a father you were taught to address the way a toddler addresses the parent who just picked them up. There is a fourth term worth pausing on before we move forward, because it shows up so often in English translations that people stop noticing it is even a translated word at all, believers. In Greek, the term is pistoi, and it comes from the same root as pistis, faith, and pisteuo, to believe or to trust. Paul uses it as a description of identity, not merely an inner mental state. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, he tells Timothy to be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Notice that believer here functions almost like a category of person the way citizen or neighbor would. And here is what most people miss about this word. Pistis in the world Paul lived in was not primarily about intellectual assent to a set of facts. It carried the sense of loyalty, allegiance, and trust placed in a person. A pistos was someone faithful, reliable, bound by loyalty. So when Paul calls someone a believer, he is not describing a person who has checked a doctrinal box. He is describing someone whose allegiance has shifted, someone who has pledged their trust to a particular Lord. That word allegiance is closer to the emotional center of pistis than our modern thinned-out use of believe as a synonym for think, probably true. Luke, writing the books of Acts, adds one more term to this picture, one that predates even the label Christian, and was almost certainly the very first thing outsiders called this group before Antioch ever coined its nickname, Mathatai, disciples. It is the same word used constantly in the Gospels for the 12 who followed Jesus during his earthly ministry. And Luke keeps using it in Acts to describe the growing movement after the resurrection. Then the disciples determined each according to his ability to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. Luke writes in Acts chapter 11, verse 29, in the very same chapter where the word Christian first appears just a few verses later. A disciple, methates, is literally a learner, someone apprenticed to a teacher, walking alongside a rabbi to absorb not just his words but his way of life. Long before the crowd in Antioch needed a label for this new group, the group already had a self-understanding baked into that word. They were apprentices, learners, people still in the process of becoming like the one they followed. Now here is where the story gets even more interesting, because so far we have looked at what Paul called the people. But there is another term used elsewhere in the New Testament, and almost certainly circulating among believers, even if it does not appear explicitly inside Paul's own letters, that describes not who they were but what they were doing. And it might be the most important term of all, because it tells you that this movement, in its earliest self-understanding, was not a set of doctrines to believe, it was a road to walk. The term is the way. In Acts chapter 9 verse 2, before his conversion, Saul of Tarsus requests letters from the high priest, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Later, after his conversion, the same term keeps surfacing to describe the very movement he now belongs to. In Acts chapter 19 verse 9, some in Ephesus spoke evil of the way before the multitude. In Acts chapter 24 verse 14, standing on trial before the Roman governor Felix, Paul himself uses this term to describe his own faith. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers. Here is what most people never realize about that verse. Paul is standing in a Roman courtroom under formal accusation, and when asked to identify what he believes the word he reaches for is not a doctrine or a denomination, it is the way. Hodos in Greek meaning literally a road, a path, a journey with a direction. And this is not an accident of vocabulary. It connects directly back to something Jesus said about himself. In John chapter 14 verse 6, Jesus tells his disciples, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The Greek word there is the same word hodos. Jesus does not say, "I have the way," or "I teach the way." He says, "I am the way." The movement that formed around him took that identification and let it become their own name, at least informally in the years before any other label stuck. They were not people who had adopted a set of beliefs about Jesus. They were people walking a road that Jesus himself claimed to be. Think about how different that is from the modern experience of a religious label. When you tell someone you are a member of a particular faith today, you are usually describing an institution you belong to or a doctrinal box you check. The way describes something closer to a direction of travel. You do not finish being on a road. You keep walking it. If this is opening something up for you, something you have read past 100 times without noticing, take a second and share this with someone who loves digging into the text the way you clearly do. Subscribing helps more people find studies like this one, and we are only about halfway through what these words actually reveal. So if Paul never called it Christianity, and the earliest believers called themselves the set-apart ones, the brothers, the called-out assembly and people of the way, where did the actual word Christian come from? Because it does show up in the New Testament, just not from Paul's own pen as a term he applies to himself or the churches he plants. The word appears for the first time in Acts chapter 11 verse 26, and the detail of how it arrives is easy to skim past. Luke writes that after Barnabas brought Saul to Antioch and the two of them taught a great many people there for a full year, the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Notice the passive voice. They were called this. The text does not say the believers named themselves this. It says the label was applied to them, almost certainly by outsiders in Antioch, a cosmopolitan Greco-Roman city, with a habit of coining nicknames for political and religious factions based on the name of their leader. The word Christianoi is built the same way Roman political labels were built at the time, the way Herodianoi described the followers of Herod. It essentially means partisans of Christ, and it was very likely coined by non-believers in Antioch as a way of categorizing this strange new group, not quite Jews, not pagan, but partisans of someone they called the Christ. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. The term shows up only 2 more times in the entire New Testament, once in Acts chapter 26 verse 28, where King Agrippa says to Paul, almost mockingly, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." And once in 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 16, where Peter writes, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." That is the entire New Testament usage of the word, 3 times, never once from the mouth or pen of Paul as his own chosen term. Every other time we hear him describe the movement in letter after letter, in his own theological vocabulary. He reaches for ekklesia hagioi, adelphoi, and the language of the way. The word Christian was in its origin something said about them, not something they said about themselves. Now let's push this even further outside the Bible, because this is where the historical record becomes genuinely fascinating, and it confirms the pattern we are tracing. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing near the end of the 1st century, refers to the tribe of Christians in a passage about Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews, using the outsider's term, the label that had already taken hold in public discourse by his time. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing his annals around the year 116, describes how the Emperor Nero blamed a devastating fire in Rome on a group whom the crowd called Christians, and Tacitus adds that this name derived from Christus, who had been executed under Pontius Pilate. Notice again the phrasing, whom the crowd called. Even a Roman senator writing decades after Paul's death still frames Christian as the public's label for the group, not the group's label for itself. There is one more piece of outside evidence worth setting alongside Josephus and Tacitus, because it comes from a source with no theological stake in the matter at all: government correspondence. Around the year 112, a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger, administering the province of Bithynia in what is now northern Turkey, wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan asking for guidance on how to handle people being accused of being Christiani before his court. Pliny describes interrogating them, describes some who deny the charge, and describes others who admit it, and describe meeting before dawn to sing a hymn to Christ as to a god, and to bind themselves by oath to a life of honesty. What is striking for our purposes is that Pliny is using a term he clearly received from public usage, from accusers and informants, not a term the movement itself had handed him as its official self-designation. A Roman bureaucrat decades after Paul is still working with the crowd's word, still trying to pin down exactly what kind of thing this Christian label refers to. The label had outlasted Paul, but it was still even then primarily a term of external classification rather than internal identity. And here is perhaps the most telling piece of the whole puzzle. The actual word Christianity, Christianismos in Greek, does not appear inside the New Testament at all. Not once in any book by any author. Its earliest known appearance in surviving literature comes from a bishop named Ignatius of Antioch, writing around the year 107 or 110, roughly 4 decades after Paul's death, in letters he wrote on his way to martyrdom in Rome. Ignatius uses the term Christianismos, deliberately contrasting it with Judaismos, Judaism, as he works to define this movement as something distinct from its Jewish roots, for a new generation of believers who needed clearer boundaries. By the time Ignatius is writing, the movement had spread across the empire, faced sustained persecution, and needed the kind of institutional self-definition that a word like Christianity provides. But that need did not exist in Paul's lifetime, not in the same way. Paul was not building an institution with a brand name. He was tending an assembly, a family, a people walking a road. In the earliest and most fragile years, before anyone had settled on what to formally call the whole thing. Think about it like a family that has not yet chosen a last name. The people are unmistakably related. They eat together. They carry each other's burdens. They identify with the same father. But the paperwork, the formal designation that outsiders will eventually stamp on the census and the history books, has not been written yet. That is roughly where Paul is standing. He knows exactly who these people are to him and to God. He simply has not needed the word that later centuries would use to file them under a single heading. Or think about it a different way. Imagine a young couple who has just had their first child, and for the first few months, nobody outside the house has any formal word for what is happening inside it. The parents do not think of themselves as members of an institution called parenthood. They think in far more immediate terms: feeding this particular child, walking this particular hallway at 3 in the morning, learning this particular baby's cries. The label parent as a category on a form comes later, and it is useful. But it was never how the actual experience felt from the inside. That is close to the gap between Paul's letters and the later word Christianity. The label is not wrong, it is just late, and it is thinner than the reality it is trying to describe. This matters for more than historical trivia, and here is why. If the earliest and most theologically precise writer in the New Testament described this movement primarily as an assembly, a family of set-apart brothers and sisters, and a road being walked rather than a religion being practiced, then something has almost certainly been lost in translation between his century and ours. Somewhere between Paul's pen and the modern use of the word Christianity, the movement got reframed, at least in popular imagination. From a family you belong to and a road you walk into, a set of beliefs. You check off an identity category you claim on a form. Paul would recognize very little of that. He wrote to brothers. He wrote to saints. He wrote to people who were, in his own words in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, a new creation, people for whom old things have passed away and all things have become new. That is not the language of religious affiliation. That is the language of transformed identity inside a family and a journey. If you have ever felt like being a Christian has become more about a label on a form than a relationship or a direction you are actually walking, this is worth sitting with. Paul never asked anyone to check a box. He asked them to walk a road to answer a summons to receive an adoption. The label came later from people watching from the outside, trying to find a word for something they could see, but did not yet understand. And there is a second application worth sitting with, one that reaches beyond personal identity into how believers relate to each other. If the earliest word for this movement was ekklesia, the called-out assembly, and if Paul almost never uses that word for a building or an institution, but always for people gathered together, then something has quietly shifted in how many modern believers think about belonging. It becomes easy, especially now, to imagine faith as something you can practice essentially alone, a private matter between an individual and God, disconnected from any actual assembly of brothers and sisters. Paul would have found that idea almost unintelligible. For him, you were not simply a believer who happened to also attend a church. You were by definition part of an assembly grafted into brothers and sisters whose burdens became your burdens. The Greek word itself will not let you separate the individual from the family. Whatever it means to follow Jesus in Paul's vocabulary, it means being adopted into people, not merely into a private conviction. And third, if the earliest name for this whole movement before Christian ever entered the vocabulary was simply the way, then perhaps the most Pauline question to ask yourself is not what do I believe, but which direction am I walking? Beliefs can be recited without changing anything about how a life moves. A road, by contrast, has to be walked one step after another, and it becomes obvious fairly quickly whether you are actually on it or merely admiring it from a distance. Paul spent his whole ministry, chains and shipwrecks and floggings included, walking that road all the way to Rome. He never once needed the word Christianity to describe what he was doing. He needed the road, the family, and the assembly, and above everything else, the person the road was named after. Before we close, it is worth taking a second to just say thank you for sticking with a study like this one, tracing individual Greek words across an entire body of letters. If this kind of deep textual digging matters to you, consider joining as a channel member, or at the very least take 30 seconds to leave a comment about which of these words hit you the hardest. That kind of engagement is genuinely how more people find studies like this. So let's bring this all the way home. 4 words, 4 windows into how Paul actually understood this movement before anyone called it Christianity. Ekklesia, the called-out assembly, the same word used for Israel gathered at Sinai, now applied to a scattered mixed body of Jews and Gentiles summoned out of the world for a purpose. Hagioi, the set-apart ones, ordinary people in ordinary cities marked off not for their moral perfection, but for God's use, the same way the Sabbath and the tabernacle were once marked off. Adelphoi, brothers and sisters, the language of a family bound not by blood but by adoption, crying out to a father with the same intimate word a toddler uses for a parent. And the way, hodos, a road, a direction, a journey that could not be separated from the man who claimed to be the road himself. And maybe the part that stays with me most is this. The word Christian entered the story almost as an afterthought, a label pinned on this movement by outsiders in Antioch who needed some way to categorize what they were seeing. It was never the movement's own first choice of words for itself. That should tell you something about what actually mattered to the people living inside it. They were not primarily concerned with what they were called. They were concerned with who they belonged to and what road they were walking and what family had adopted them. The label came from the crowd. The identity came from the summons. 2,000 years later, we have inherited the crowd's word and mostly forgotten the family's language underneath it. But the road is still there. The assembly is still being called out. And the invitation to be adopted into a family that calls God Abba has not expired. If this opens something up for you, help us reach someone else with it. Subscribe, leave a comment. Even a single word helps more people find this. Share it with someone who loves digging into these details as much as you clearly do. Pray for us. God bless you.